This is our program for the week of March 31st, 2025. By now, we're all aware of the abduction and detention of Rumesia Ozturk. She's among a growing list of immigrant students being targeted by the Trump regime for their outspoken activism on Palestine. Her attorneys read a statement from her just a few days ago in which she courageously defended her free speech and asked others to keep up the fight. So let's have a listen.
I am a PhD student working with children and youth. We know that injustice in the world and systemic brutality towards people of color has long-lasting negative effects on children, youth, and our communities. My life is committed to choosing peaceful and inclusive ways to meet the needs of children. I believe the world is a more beautiful and peaceful place when we listen to each other and allow different perspectives to be in the room. Writing is one of the most peaceful ways of addressing systemic inequality. Efforts to target me because of my op-ed in the Tough Daily, calling for the equal dignity and humanity of all people, will not deter me from my commitment to advocate for the rights of youth and children. To this day, even though Rumeisa has been in some of the most inhumane situations that one could imagine, she is actually still worried about children in Gaza and the genocide that's happening. And she asks all of you to continue to speak out and support children everywhere so that they can grow up in a very loving, compassionate community. Thank you.
Rumeisa's attorneys also shared that she's been struggling since her time in custody under cruel conditions of confinement. Her Congresswoman, Ayanna Pressley, shared a statement from her attorneys in which they outlined some of those conditions, including 3 asthma attacks that Rumeisa suffered while in detention without the aid of needed asthmatic medications. Rumeisa is being held in Louisiana along with Mahmoud Khalil and for a brief time Badr Kansuri, the researcher at Georgetown who was subsequently moved to an ICE facility in Texas. The facilities in which they're detained are part of what's being called the Detention Alley, a network of remote immigration detention centers stretching between Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Deep in the red state South, this area includes, according to The Guardian, 14 of the country's 20 largest detention centers, and that's where they're sending students after being arrested thousands of miles away. Rumeisa Ozturk has been sent to the South Louisiana ICE processing facility in the swamplands of Evangeline Parish. And to report on this story, journalists from The Guardian visited Louisiana facilities and the immigration court in LaSalle, where thousands of cases are being processed. An immigrant rights attorney with the ACLU in Louisiana who was interviewed said that, quote, most of the folks in detention in Louisiana aren't the ones making the news, but they are experiencing similar, if not the same treatment as those who are. In fact, as The Guardian reports, substantiated allegations of medical neglect have plagued these facilities for years. In 2018, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, which has already seen drastic cuts as part of this administration's slashing of federal infrastructure, particularly civil rights offices within departments of the federal government, looked at 4 fatalities that occurred at the Gina, Louisiana facility run by the notorious private corrections company GEO Group. In examining those deaths, DHS identified a pattern of delay in medical care, citing, quote, a failure of nursing staff to report abnormal vital signs. At the all-female South Louisiana ICE Processing Center operated by GEO Group, where Rumeisa is now being held, the ACLU of Louisiana recently filed a complaint to that same DHS Civil Rights Division alleging more rights violations. Those included inadequate access to medical care, just as she was already experiencing and as we described earlier in her brief time there. Quote, guards left detained people suffering from severe conditions like external bleeding, tremors, sprained limbs, all unattended to, refusing them access to diagnostic care. These are just a few of the names of people who have been arrested, detained, deported, or otherwise forced to leave the country because they spoke out on Palestine or alleged to have spoken out on Palestine and engaged in activities on behalf of the Palestine Solidarity Movement. Mamadou Tal is a doctoral student in Africana Studies at Cornell University and is a dual citizen of the UK and Gambia. He participated in pro-Palestine protests last year, calling on Cornell to divest from companies that sell weapons to Israel, and he self-deported recently. Yunseo Chung is a junior at Columbia University and an LPR from Korea, and she was targeted for arrest rather for her involvement in Palestine protests on Columbia's campus, but fortunately secured a judicial order recently, which, at least for the time being, prevents further attempts at her arrest. And Rajani Srinivasan wasn't even involved in the protests, but received a citation while walking on the Columbia campus during the arrests of students at Hinds Hall. And despite her insistence on this publicly and her self-deportation, Kristi Noem has still publicly called her a supporter of Hamas and a supporter of terrorism. Samara, we are, still keeping track of so many of these arrests and detentions of folks. It's too much to keep track of, but an interesting article here in the Guardian that I think does a good job of helping identify the importance of linking the struggle against mass deportation. Lots of other people who are not involved in Palestine's solidarity work or in protest activity are being detained on a regular basis in inhumane conditions. And with some hope, these incidents that are happening with the Palestine Solidarity Movement are drawing some attention there. Um, I'm sure you'll touch upon some of this in your conversation with us today, but how has your week been and how are you doing, comrade?
Do it. Should we start the usual way? Oof, what a week.
No, it feels very difficult to say anything otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, it's our like sadder version of the John Oliver welcome, welcome, welcome. Always just say, oof, what a week. But yeah, I mean, how do you hold it all and keep going and think about the sort of long term, what is it? Um, Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Optimism. Yeah.
Always try to hold on to that. Always try to hold on to that. And, like the crisis presents opportunities. I do always try to center that
Of
piece. Like
course.
even as you were just saying, this idea that clearly the Trump administration is using this assault on the Palestine solidarity movement to open a front in which it can attack the broader progressive movement. And we're seeing that because obviously people are too scared to stand up for the folks who are standing up for Palestine, unsurprisingly. But once again, that just, puts the position of the Palestine solidarity movement, to not only like block the sort of fascist genocidal actions in Palestine, but to protect whatever semblance of democracy is left in this country. It's on us, right? It's on us and our allies. So it's heavy, but also, what a privilege to be given to be like the vanguard of that fight. So it's nice to be here with you, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyway, we're grateful to have you and looking forward to your analysis today.
Thanks, Thomas. Always great to be here. Jumping right in, there's a lot, obviously, in terms of what's been happening in Gaza and around it. Uh, the clearest, I would say, big indications that are coming through this week have been on Israel's total rejection of any idea of returning to a sort of ceasefire dynamic. Last week we were discussing whether there was some possibility that these big moves were an attempt to sort of, push their bargaining hand with the ceasefire negotiations. But unfortunately, it does seem to be the case that that no, and I don't think it's a big surprise to anybody, but in fact, the real push here is that Israel is just trying to re-secure control over the Gaza Strip, and they seem to be pushing this idea of, um, you know, not just the annexation and military control of the broader area, but also the sort of furthering of Trump's Riviera plan, right? Like that's where we're at, I think, in this idea of so-called voluntary migration. So what we're seeing on the ground this week is, a stated plan of ramping up what what the IDF is calling maximum pressure, basically saying that over the next 2 to 3 weeks, things are just going to get progressively worse. And they're explicitly saying that this plan, as it's currently designed, is a step towards implementing the government's plan for voluntary departure. So, like the specific idea here is that we need to make people feel like they have to leave and then provide the context for them to do so. So there's this sort of pushing of the Gaza population into as like narrow an area as possible. This is like the sort of Al-Mawasi, um, so-called humanitarian zone that they bomb regularly. But uh, this like the broader occupation of what's happening in Gaza and the annexation of those areas to basically push all Palestinians out. And so what the Israeli defense minister was saying this week was like these new moves, particularly down in Rafah, are like designed to, destroy. The way that he put it, I thought was very telling. He said, destroy terrorists and infrastructure. So like we're going after, Hamas and we're going after infrastructure, not Hamas infrastructure, just infrastructure. And then his like follow up to that was that we're capturing territory that will be added to Israel's security areas. So saying very explicitly, we're annexing this territory. Um, And so, one big piece of that is, of course, what Netanyahu himself is referring to as dissecting the Gaza Strip, basically chopping it up into as many small pieces as they possibly can. So we already know, there's the Philadelphia corridor that Israel bulldozed open, when it did its assault on Rafah, like a year ago at this point. And there was the so-called Netzarim corridor, which is named after an Israeli settlement that cut the Gaza Strip in half. And they've now announced plans for a new third corridor that I think they're calling the Morag corridor, which also named after a former Israeli settlement in Gaza. Again, if you had any illusions of what they're trying to do here. Um, and so just like adding to that, it seems very clear to me that the only reason they would be doing something like this, then this Morag corridor cuts off Rafah, like the Rafah area from the Khan Yunis area above it. So it seems like what's very likely to happen now is the full evacuation of Rafah. So like just pushing everybody out from that southern area to empty it out into like a similar sort of death zone that they were trying to create in the north. Only this time with like, yeah, encircling it and then closing in. And they've already announced the evacuations from Rafah. So that does seem to be like the plan and, pushing them into this humanitarian zone. You'll note that this actually cuts off a chunk of the humanitarian zone, but, that's never stopped them before. It's this ever shrinking area that they're pushing people into. Um, in the context of all of this, of course, we're continuing to see these really horrific war crimes that are being committed in Gaza. There was the revelation this week that I'm sure a lot of people saw of the discovery of what they're calling an impromptu mass grave that was hastily covered by Israeli bulldozers, where this medical team that had been missing for a couple of weeks now, and that included like paramedics, folks from UNRWA, civil defense folks. Turns out that they had been killed 2 weeks ago, and then all of them dumped into a mass grave. Summarily executed is a phrase that I've seen in some of the news articles. Israel is, of course, claiming that the vehicle approached them suspiciously, which, like, given that it was broad daylight and in a clearly marked, like, health vehicle, doesn't really stand up much, but they don't really have to. Uh, and so, in addition to this like really horrific crime, on top of all the other crimes of this mass grave of Palestinian health workers and medics, um, we also saw last week the first ever, as far as I know, first ever death of a Palestinian child in Israeli custody. A 17-year-old, Walid Ahmed, was killed, and this week they performed the autopsy and found signs of starvation, malnutrition, and poor hygiene, basically. Just, again, just war crime conditions, right? Uh, with really clear, like the autopsy showed medical neglect in a way that this person clearly needed medical care and wasn't getting it at all. And so this has happened a lot to detainees, political prisoners being held in Israeli jails. This is the first child that has happened to, and there are many, many children, of course, being held in Israeli detention, many of whom are as young as 11 or 12. So um, it was an inevitability, and here we are, I suppose. Now, in terms of where the ceasefire itself is, there are these sort of like, dueling proposals that are being bounced around. The mediators, the so-called mediators of the ceasefire process, Qatar and Egypt, proposed a ceasefire plan that laid out a 50-day cessation of hostilities in exchange for 5 living political prisoners being held by Hamas and other armed groups in Gaza, and that those 50 days would contain like the negotiations that would lead to phase two. So again, this is an extension of phase one. Please refer to previous PSAs if you don't know what I'm talking about with the phase ones and phase twos. We've talked about them a lot. Um, so Hamas accepted that offer, put forward by the mediators of the ceasefire negotiations, and Israel immediately rejected it. And they have what they said is they've put forward a counter offer or a counter proposal that instead of 5 political prisoners, Hamas would release half of the remaining living political prisoners, so just under half. So it would be 11 out of the remaining 24, along with half of the deceased prisoners for a shorter ceasefire, which is a 40-day instead of a 50-day. But it's really clear, I think, that these negotiations aren't happening in good faith. Like there is no actual interest from Israel in returning to these ceasefire negotiations, or rather, they're happy for phase one to continue indefinitely, but not for any real move from a cessation into a ceasefire. So it seems clear that they're just, whatever gets thrown out, Israel is just going to disagree. And that's the situation we're stuck in now. Because again, I think the plan very clearly uh, is to push for this Riviera thing. So like to push for the full the so-called voluntary migration of Palestinians out of Gaza. So just the ethnic cleansing of the entire Gaza Strip. Um, just the like ultimate end of a 2-year genocidal campaign. It's not a surprising outcome. At the same time, there is a surprising amount of resistance within Israel itself, not only for this like war that um, Israeli reservists are now referring to as like being conducted beyond all reason and causing harm to the country's long-term survival is the way that they're describing it. So we're seeing, this Times of Israel article about dozens of Israeli medical reservists who are refusing to return to service, and this is on top of, hundreds upon hundreds of regular army reservists who are not coming in. Um, and in the context of what uh, the Israeli government is calling a manpower crisis, the idea that the reservists aren't showing up and they don't have the numbers of troops that they need in order to sort of do this massive full-scale occupation invasion of Gaza. Remember how badly it went for Israel last year? In the context of all of that, the government is refusing to conscript additional people. We talked about quite some time ago on the PSA, for those of you who have been with us for a long time, the Supreme Court order in Israel that forced the ultra-Orthodox men of like draft age to be included in the draft and the compulsory military service. But because the ultra-Orthodox are like a core aspect of the right-wing coalition that is currently ruling, this like Netanyahu hard-right coalition, the government is refusing to conscript them and to draft them. And so even in this context of the IDF totally not meeting whatever basic mobilization numbers it needs for this attack on Gaza, they're like it's a existential issue for the different parts of this coalition. Like they're not able to bring in the additional people that they would need to fill those ranks. And in the West Bank, in the latest Orwellian twist, we're seeing the defense minister talking about cracking down on illegal construction, but not the illegal construction of settlements that are happening all over the West Bank, of course, but rather Palestinian buildings that don't have permits, which is just a long-standing Israeli way of destroying Palestinian infrastructure, basically by not allowing for any building permits. And then when anyone tries to build a house or any other infrastructure, the Israeli army tears it down because it doesn't have the appropriate permits, but it's impossible to get the permits. So you end up in this bit of a circle. Um, and the statements about this so-called crackdown, once again, are really telling about the broader annexation plans of the West Bank, where the defense minister, says something about like oh, the West Bank is the heart of Israel and we'll protect it by any means necessary. And this is Judea and Samaria, which is the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, and we're here to stay. So, like, again, just in very plain language. I was going to say plain English, but it's probably in Hebrew. In plain Hebrew, saying, like, yeah, we're annexing the West Bank. Um, so I think that's an inevitable furthering of this plan that we've been seeing put in place for the last few months. I also wanted to, while we were talking about this West Bank crisis, uplift this open letter that was put out by Hamle, with like a coalition of Palestinian civil society groups, basically calling out all of the different ways that Israel is trying to destroy Palestinian civil society. So I would definitely recommend people give that a read and share it around. I think they're trying to get as much traction on that letter as possible. So your help, I'm sure, would be appreciated. Moving out a bit to Lebanon, a couple of fascinating things happening here. One, uh, just in an absolute mess of a dynamic that is a little bit hard to parse, but I'll do my best. It seems that the United States, we talked about on the PSA a few months ago, like when the whole new government in Lebanon thing went through, the US was pushing really hard for the guy that did end up becoming the new president, Joseph Aoun. Um, and apparently, one of the reasons that everyone in the Lebanese parliament was okay with sort of fast tracking the US pick for the new Lebanese president was that the US had promised Saudi money for the reconstruction of Lebanon. So a little bit weird combination of things there, but that Saudi money never showed up. And so Lebanon is getting really upset at the United States for like, okay, we did this with the expectation that money would come, and then no money came. And the US now is basically saying, well, to get the Saudi money, you have to get tougher on Hezbollah. Which like not only does that not really make any sense given like what more is there to do, but also like why do the Saudis care that the Lebanese get tough on Hezbollah? It doesn't actually make any sense. And what seems to likely be the case is that um, Hezbollah or Saudi is withholding the money as a pressure tactic on the United States. So it has nothing to do with what Lebanon is doing, but Saudi is saying, we're not going to pay out this money until the United States does something on Gaza. So like this like absolute mess of a combo of things where the US is pretending like the Saudis are holding the money because they're mad about Hezbollah, but the Saudis are actually mad about US complicity in the genocide in Gaza. It's a worthwhile article, by the way, if you want to lose your mind for 20 minutes. But also at the same time, what we're seeing is, of course, these like four areas in Lebanon that the IDF has refused to withdraw from in violation of the ceasefire with Lebanon. In addition to this, like, now new really heavy bombardment of southern Beirut in the like, traditional Hezbollah stronghold. Um, and this sort of idea that they were, they're now specifically saying troops are staying in these areas in southern Lebanon without a time limit. And we're going to be here because we need to defend our border communities. And I thought that this quote was just so perfect that I had to like put it in the slide specifically because the like IDF commander, well, the defense minister Katz is visiting the occupied areas in southern Lebanon, and he says, "This is what victory looks like. The IDF is here, and the communities below are protected and active." And this is happening in a one of the areas that they occupied that they're calling Margaliot Defender, because like that's the Israeli town across the border that they're supposedly defending. And literally the next sentence of the article is like, yeah, no one has returned to Margaliot because it's not safe. So like the idea that they're actually defending any communities is just total fiction, right? Because Hezbollah is still sending rockets into northern Israel. So like those communities are not in fact safe. And it's just a land grab that they seem to be like trying to, gussy up as some sort of like, oh, we're defending communities that don't even exist. So there they are in Lebanon, and then also in Syria. I think this, for once, New York Times article did a decent job of like showing how Israel has sort of cemented these occupations of areas in both Lebanon and Syria, and they're building these permanent pieces of infrastructure there. to make their occupation permanent. And in so doing, they're just like really, really uh, um, like inflaming tensions with the communities that they're occupying. Obviously, nobody wants to be occupied by the Israeli government. And so, as we talked about last week, there are these big Israeli incursions into southern Syria that ended up with a lot of Syrians being killed by the IDF. The funeral for those people happened, I think, yesterday, actually, with thousands of people coming out in Daraa, basically saying we want Israel to leave immediately. And so the anger against Israel is really ramping up, particularly, after hundreds of airstrikes across Syria, and bigger ground incursions, and Israel is claiming that the people that they killed were like, in typical fashion, right? That terrorists who were attacking Israel, had to be subdued, something, something. And it turns out, because, we saw the funerals now, that it was like a tailor and a shopkeeper and a couple of construction workers who were basically just trying to defend their town from marauding Israeli soldiers. So um, yeah, so that kind of argument obviously isn't getting very far. And so Israel, in its attempt to sort of build rapport with like the Druze community in southern Syria and all of that, it's starting to backfire because they're just way too heavy-handed in the way that they're like attacking and killing people. And then the big, probably regional news of the week is around Iran, where the nuclear talks are set to possibly resume. I thought that this combination of Al Jazeera articles was kind of great, where on the 30th of March, Iran explicitly and openly says we're not willing to have direct nuclear talks with Trump. And then 4 days later, on April 3rd, Trump says Iran wants direct talks with the United States, which, like, no, they don't. But it seems, despite the fact that Trump is the one that sunk the old Iranian nuclear deal that Obama had signed in his term, he's really keen for a new deal, it seems, possibly. And Iran basically put out a statement, very understandably saying something along the lines of like, how can we negotiate with the United States given that we already negotiated a deal and then the US ripped it up a year later? So like we can't trust the United States to be a negotiator in this. We're happy to have negotiations, but they can't be direct negotiations with the United States. And so that seems to be, despite the Trumpy talk in the article on the right, like that seems to be palatable to the US administration right now, that like, okay, indirect talks might be a way to get this nuclear deal signed. But, you know, as we've talked about a number of times, there are competing political factions within the Trump administration. One group that wants a nuclear deal to like start this process of normalization and move on to other strategic areas so that they're not bogged down in the Middle East forever. And another faction that just wants war with Iran. And it's still not clear who's going to win that fight. And so both of them want these negotiations. One group wants the negotiations because they want an agreement that can like lead to something that, changes their focus. The others want the negotiations as a pretense so that when the negotiation fails, they have a pretext for war with Iran. Um, and I think we're not going to know which of those sides will win out for some time. But what we are seeing is an unprecedented, they're calling it a record-breaking U.S. deployment in the Middle East. They're sending another aircraft carrier group. If you remember, Biden sent one last year, the Harry Truman, and now they're sending the Carl Vinson. So doubling the like air support capacity in the Middle East, along with a series of other, like a bunch of stealth bombers and air defenses and munitions, just basically setting up for what would be war with Iran, right? There's no other way of looking at this. Obviously part of this is a response to like the ongoing strikes that the US is conducting on Yemen, but like you don't need two Air Force or air carrier strike groups for yet. Like you just it's way out of proportion to what they're doing in Yemen. So it seems very clearly either a threat for Iran or preparation for war with Iran. And again, we're not going to really know which one it is yet, but the Macron issued something a couple days ago saying that this is uh, like uh, like an immediate existential threat of war feels like very much on the horizon. Like it's never been closer. So I think that's probably true. Uh, but Trump has ostensibly offered is the wrong word. Trump has issued a 2-month ultimatum to Iran about this deal. So I don't think anything's going to happen before those 2 months. But I think in these next 2 months, we'll see what happens in terms of those dynamics and what happens going forward. Moving back to the United States, just a little on the campus crackdowns here. Thomas talked a lot about this on the top, so I don't want to spend too much time here, but just to say, the administration is continuing to use this like foreign policy immigration provision uh, to do these like student deportations and visa cancellations, basically uh, asserting that these students have a like their very presence in the United States has potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences. And so like that's the only argument that they have for deporting all of these students because again, they're not committing any crimes, they're not actually doing anything against the law or that violates any sort of aspect of their visas. It's just a pretense to kick these people out. And because it's so sort of like extrajudicial, they're using this more or less unheard of immigration provision that has never really been used before. It's catching students off guard. They're not even consulting universities. Historically, like the university that sponsors the student visa cancels it if that, situation ever occurs, but they're not even telling the universities sometimes. They're just canceling people's visas, which means they show up at the border and find out that their visa has been canceled. And, again, right, the cruelty and the fear here is the point, right? Like that's what they're trying to do. Um, it feels so widespread now, but we're talking about a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of students. Uh, Even a tiny fraction of like Palestinian solidarity immigrant students. But they're trying to make everyone else scared to say something or do something because they won't know what's happening. Um, and the New York Times has this like sort of dive into this like new reality of campus surveillance and campus crackdowns and free speech attacks. They're calling it like a threat to civil liberties, which thank you, New York Times. The fact that for those of you who are watching this on video, like you can see in the New York Times article at the top left there, they're calling it campus crackdown, which is like, that like high level thematic thing that they do now. But for the last year, literally until like this new level of whatever Trump horror, that little top left corner said anti-Semitism on campus when they were describing literally student protesters being beaten by the police, right? So like they are also partly responsible for creating this dynamic where, under the guise of anti-Semitism, um, they're punishing all of these students and attacking their free speech and civil liberties. So too little, too late, New York Times. Um, at the same time, like, of course, there's this really widespread social media scare where the State Department is scouring the social media of current students and any visa applicants. And just as a reminder to all of you, like if your social media is public, like that's something that the government may or may not be looking at. Um, and again, in a sort of attempt to uh, dig out any sort of support for Palestine at all from like anybody who doesn't have permanent citizenship status in this country. And even those people are probably coming soon at some point. Um, and so, yeah, this uh, one of the things that came out of this that like Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, said specifically was like these new rules might cause some foreign citizens who have a critical view of the United States to forego applying for a visa. And that's what they want. Like that is a stated preferred outcome. Like the goal here is for people who might be inclined to criticize the US government or its proxies to just not come here at all, right? Or to leave and self-deport and all of these things. And so like again, the fear and the cruelty is the point. Um, and the big move here was that like last week 300 ish a little over 300 students had their visas revoked. And again, under the guise of combating anti-Semitism, basically just, using AI to pull social media posts that people wrote about Palestine and then revoking visas for those 300 people. And again, this is, in California alone, you've probably got 10,000 um, international students who are here uh, who have said something on Palestine, at least. And so like it's a drop in the bucket, but like it's designed to make all 10,000 of those people in California and the hundreds of thousands across the country feel like they can't say anything. Um, and really horrifyingly for me, I was like trying to find an article to post about this, and I don't know, maybe I did a bad job looking, but even this one from NBC News is like hundreds of student visas revoked and Greenlanders anti-American sentiment. Like I could barely find any articles about this. It was shockingly thin in terms of media coverage that literally hundreds of students had their visas revoked overnight with like basically no warning and have to leave the country. So people aren't taking it nearly as seriously as they probably should be. And I think, there's this sort of liberal copium that, this is just about Palestine, and if they keep their heads down, it'll all blow over. But obviously, that is not what's going to happen. It's going to extend past Palestine into 100 other issues. And once they've started the precedent here, it's going to be a lot harder to turn it back. And so it's good that there is some real popular resistance here, not only by students and like the broader Palestine solidarity movement. There was this incredible action at Columbia this week where a bunch of alumni showed up at the front gate and then ripped up their diplomas, which was really powerful, I think. But also the institutions themselves, I think, on some level are starting to learn that, folding to everything the Trump administration asks for doesn't actually get you anything. And that the smarter move here is to actually do some sort of meaningful structured resistance. So one nice thing that we've seen is that Tufts, which is the university that Rustamia Öztürk was at, is defending her pretty heavily, right? Like is intervening in the legal proceedings, is talking about how she's done nothing wrong, the level of support that she has on campus, et cetera, et cetera. So they're like involving themselves in the fight as opposed to what like Columbia and Johns Hopkins and a bunch of other universities have done, which is the exact opposite, which is specifically to look the other way. And what has it gotten them? It's gotten them nothing at all. They're continuing to be like defunded and attacked by the Trump administration. So there are lessons there that I really hope the UCs pick up on, as well as, whatever other campuses are dealing with this. Meanwhile, just a quick detour into our friends, the Democrats, where I really love the title of this recent article where Democrats are surprised to learn bombs are used to bomb people because, like, now Elizabeth Warren is upset that Israel is killing Palestinian civilians with the bombs that she voted to send to Israel. So, like, yeah, thank you. A good reminder that, like, for all of whatever, this like broad sense of Democrat resistance, like they're not putting up a really meaningful structural response to uh, the things that have enabled the genocide in Gaza. I think a real um, like the epitome of that for me is Cory Booker's marathon 25-hour let's defend democracy speech on the Senate floor, where he wore like an Israeli hostage pin and didn't mention Gaza a single time, not once in 25 hours, about talking about the things that, like this like creeping fascism in the United States, like nothing about the genocide that we're supporting. Of course not. Thank you, Cory Booker. At the same time, there are really meaningful shifts that I do think we need to acknowledge and capitalize on. Just yesterday, the Senate Democrats, there was another Bernie Sanders resolution to cancel billions in Israeli military aid, and we had 15 Democratic senators voting to cancel Israeli aid. That's, I think, a record number, if I'm not mistaken. So that's growing, and I think that's powerful, and that means something. And again, what we're seeing if we look at the polling is remarkable shifts, particularly within the Democratic Party, but really everyone that isn't a Republican, um, about, like realizing what's going on here. Not only is the idea of the ethnic cleansing of Gaza totally unpalatable, even to Republicans, um, who largely, I would say, disapprove of it, like Republicans disapprove of it by a ratio of 2 to 1. Um, and for Democrats, it's 9 to 1. But also, like in terms of Israel's actions in Gaza, you're seeing a record number of people recognize what's happening, where um, Democrats and independents, right? Like if you look at all Americans, over a third of them are now saying that Israel is either committing genocide or war crimes or major war crimes. Um, and for Democrats, that number is well over half, saying that Israel is committing major war crimes. And if you add like unjustified actions or people who don't, like only 10% of Democrats think that what Israel is doing is justified under self-defense. And only half of Republicans, like, basically the bottom has fallen out here. And so it's just a question of like moving that popular opinion into political discourse, which obviously is the task ahead of us. A quick update on BDS because the BDS national movement has called for like a focus on Microsoft right now with a specific focus on their game systems, just because, Microsoft has been a really key partner for Israel in providing the technological infrastructure along with Google and Amazon to perpetuate this genocide. So they're calling on people who are playing any Microsoft games, including Candy Crush and Minecraft and Call of Duty, to stop and to cancel any Microsoft subscriptions and things. So I don't know how big our gamer contingent is here, but just thought I'd at least flag that. And then one last thing that just gave me a chuckle this week because in anticipation of Trump's tariff announcements, Israel decided that it would lift all duties on U.S. imports. So Israel canceled all tariffs on U.S. imports to Israel so that there wouldn't be any tariffs imposed on it. But too bad they still got slapped with a 17% tariff, which seems to be because, as far as anyone can tell, the Trump administration used ChatGPT to determine what the appropriate tariff rates should be. And so, sorry, sorry, Israel, at a time where it's already facing the sort of like economic crisis, it just got slapped with a 17% tariff on all goods going to the United States, which is a huge, they're a huge exporter of goods to the US. So, given their already dire economic situation, the 17% tariff is actually a really big deal and may well have implications on how the war is conducted and how they can perpetuate this genocide in Gaza in terms of the resources they have available to them. So just to sum up, Israel does seem to be moving forward with this Riviera plan. It's really hard to imagine a ceasefire coming together under these circumstances. Uh, at the same time, I think like given that we need to rely on a confluence of pressures, like what's happening in the international arena, the sort of dissent that's happening inside Israel itself, obviously the military losses that Israel is facing in its occupation and its overextension into Syria and Lebanon, as well as other political and economic tools. Basically, we need to make sure that all of these things work together as a way of changing the underlying material conditions that allow this genocide to be perpetuated. And that's where I think our focus needs to be. At the same time, war with Iran probably looking more likely than ever. I feel like I've said that half a dozen times, but each time I do think it gets closer. But that's highly contingent on what happens with these negotiations, so we should just keep an eye out for that. So stay tuned. We'll I'm sure be talking about it more in the coming weeks. And then, of course, these escalated attacks on students and the Palestine Solidarity Movement need to be resisted on every front, not only to protect, to continue to do what we have to do to stop this genocide, but also because this is like the harbinger of fascism, right? Like this is how they end up attacking everybody. So unfortunately, we're the ones on the front lines, and we need to step up to that duty. And so in terms of what's coming up, I think a lot of folks were curious about what's happening tomorrow. There's supposed to be a really big march in DC and a giant rally. There are local contingents supported by JVP and Indivisible and others. So there's an action in Oakland and an action in San Francisco tomorrow. I'll be in San Francisco, but I hope you go to at least one of them. And then on Sunday, just wanted to uplift Reams, our lovely ally restaurant, where they're celebrating 10 years of resilience with an Arab-style barbecue. So that's at Reams on Sunday at 11 a.m. So hope to see you there too. And then if you want to hear about more events, just check out the AROC calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events. If you want text message updates, just text PSA to 833-633-0604. And check out the Pal Media Tracker for articles that inform this analysis. You can sign up for a weekly digest at palmediatracker.com/sign up. And that's the end of it. Thank you so much.
Sam, what are the odds that Trump is using Chat GPT for his foreign policy?
High, extremely high. This is the like, yeah, the darkest timeline that we're living in. That I mean, it's incredible. I read an article about it just yesterday, I think, where like somebody asked ChatGPT to come up with like a tariff system, and that's exactly the one that it came up with. Like it matches more or less perfectly what the Trump administration came out with, and it doesn't make sense. Like there's no rational justification for what those numbers are. So there's no way that it's not that. I'm quite convinced. And if they're using it for that, God knows what else they're using it for. So
It's just,
nightmare.
yeah, it's a funny, I mean, it's cliche to say that we're living in the most ridiculous timeline or the worst timeline or what have you, but I think your point about Booker's performance at the on the Hill. I mean, obviously, like uh, exceeding Strom Thurmond's record has some significance, but the pin and the lack of acknowledgement of any of the kind of most draconian measures that the administration is using specifically against Palestine protesters. I mean, I think I saw Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, lay out about the tariffs, like the lack of a cogent rationale, right? Because there is none for them. Obviously, it was generated by ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Um, but the Democrats just seem to kind of always avoid the centrality of Palestine and how all of this works, right? Like that the bullying of, I mean, he analogizes the bullying of the universities with what's happening with the tariff regime, right? That the idea is that he's going to basically tank the economy, impose all these tariffs, and then ask for pledged fealty from each of these industries or countries, in exchange for whatever, something of a loyalty pledge and or alignment with his administration. But
Yeah.
so much of this is just so squarely with Palestine and Gaza. It literally is starting with like a set of students or activists who are like across a wide range of activity. Yeah,
Yeah, I think I'm cautiously optimistic that this will go down as like a giant blunder for the Trump administration. That like, oh, what they perceive to be the easiest target is actually going to turn around and really bite them in the ass. So,
yeah.
I mean, it already is.
Hey, I mean, if they're operating at the level of a high school student who's like late on a term paper, it's like
Not even. I feel like high school students are smart
I
enough to
know,
like
true.
age
That's
up
just
some of
just
the
high school
ChatGPT
students paying
stuff.
attention. You're right. This is just not even aligned.